Are Prince Harry and Meghan Markle preparing for a new fight with the royal family? Could King Charles be the secret to world peace? And why have William and Catherine been told to be more regal? We've got a great episode of your favourite royal show coming up for you. Welcome to Palace Confidential. I'm Jo Elvin, and back this week is the Dream Team, Daily Mail's royal editor Rebecca English and the paper's diary editor Richard Eden. Welcome to you both. Now, a reminder, please subscribe to this YouTube channel and help us to get over that 400,000 mark. Gosh, we are so close right now. It's very exciting. Playing straight after this show is our special emergency episode. This is what we're calling it. It's True Emergency of Palace, where we analyse Meghan Markle's new Netflix show As Ever. So stick around for that. Right, before all of that though, we need to turn to King Charles, who this week has been caught up in some major international news. Now, Rebecca, let's start with a certain rather bruised Ukrainian president. What's going on?
Well, there were front page pictures really pretty much on every national newspaper in the UK, and I would actually argue a lot around the world, of the King meeting with President Zelensky of Ukraine up at Sandringham, his private bolt hole. Now, there's some really interesting background, which in a nutshell is that when President Zelensky knew he was coming to the UK, he asked for a meeting with the King. I was told that the government were consulted and they told Buckingham Palace, yes, it was fine to meet. Then we obviously had the debacle in the White House, and conversations went on between the Buckingham Palace and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, should this meeting still go ahead, and the government decided that it was. And I think it was a very powerful photograph, which they say a picture paints 1,000 words, and it certainly did with that it showed the King standing shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine.
And then another embattled world leader, not one facing war, showed up. What went on there?
Now, again, this is very interesting, and I think it's be interesting to a lot of our Canadian viewers, because their Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, was in the UK for this big summit over the schism between Ukraine and the United States. And he asked to meet the King as well. Now, on one hand, it's not surprising that the Prime Minister of a country would ask to meet his head of state when he is there. But I was told, do not underestimate the significance of this meeting by very, very good sources. And while the King, as a constitutional monarch, cannot come out swinging publicly, they try to, show, like the royal family often does, their feelings in deeds, if not necessarily words. And it was a very, very warm welcome, hands clasped, sitting together in his salon in Sandringham. And actually, the Canadian government has briefed since that the King made very clear that he supports Canada in its efforts to resist being made the 51st state of the United States of America. I mean, I can't quite even believe I'm saying those words.
It's so interesting, isn't it? Suddenly this supposedly apolitical monarchy is really getting dragged into things. I mean, Richard, the New York Times said that Charles was caught up in a, quote, a swirling diplomatic drama in a way that is almost unheard of for a British sovereign. And he's in a really tricky position, particularly where Canada's concerned, isn't he?
I think he is, and I think he needs to be careful. I mean, to be honest, I'm not sure that Queen Elizabeth would have allowed herself to be drawn in as much as she has. I mean, in the case of Zelensky asking to meet the King, that going ahead directly after the disagreements in the White House. It was very controversial, very symbolic. He didn't have to meet him. It could have been done in private, perhaps. Remember what we know about King Charles's views. He loathes Vladimir Putin. He's compared him to Hitler, as Rebecca once brilliantly revealed in a front page scoop. He thinks he's a terrible dictator. And there's President Trump trying to sort of mend fences and bring people together. So it is awkward. And when it comes to Canada, my goodness, I mean, come on, we've had Trump sort of semi-joking about making Canada a 51st state. But what he has done as a fact is impose big tariffs on Canadian goods. Well, that is the country of which the King is head of state. So it really does, I would argue, it puts the state visit of Donald Trump to Britain into jeopardy.
I would be so bold as to maybe play devil's advocate on your assertion about the Queen there, because the Queen, don't forget, will have remembered very much an imperiled Europe. She may well have felt compelled to get involved at this crisis.
Yeah, I mean, look, who knows? We've had this before when talking about Princess Diana, that it's tasteless to speculate about what dead people would do. But either way, I'm just saying the king needs to be careful and the people around him need to know that.
I mean, I would say that we do know, for example, that there was a very meaningful intervention in the Brexit debate from Queen Elizabeth, also in the Scottish independence vote. And actually, one thing I should add, because again, I think it might be of interest to our North American viewers, is there have been a lot of questions about why King Charles hasn't had a realm visit to Canada yet since he's become king, because obviously he is the head of state of Canada. And he was meant to visit this time last year, but obviously because of his cancer diagnosis couldn't. Then because he already had the big trip to Australia and Samoa already in the diary and 2 other inward state visits, he couldn't do it. But I've been told it is an absolute priority as soon as the election cycle is out the way in Canada for him to get out.
Well, he needs to get in there quickly before Trump, annexes.
And he has to get a visa.
And the timing is going to be crucial because Trump is going to be coming to Scotland potentially in the summer for a private visit to discuss the forthcoming state visit. That will almost certainly happen unless things go disastrously wrong, but they're going to fit it in, him going to Canada as soon as they can after that and before President Trump's state visit to the UK.
So tell us
a lot about juggling.
Tell us what you know about how these visits work. Who is the directive? Who directs here? Is it Charles inviting heads of state? Is it the British government telling Charles he needs to invite heads of states, or it's the British government inviting? What?
It's very much the latter, actually.
Right.
These state visits are undertaken at the request of the British government. Now, of course, I think if, the monarch, whoever it might be, or Buckingham Palace had a particularly strong objection to it, that clearly would be taken on board. But as we know, we've had state visits here that Queen Elizabeth was responsible for as host. For example, when the Chinese president came to visit, and memorably, the king now, who was then Prince of Wales, boycotted the state banquet because he was so opposed to their treatment of Tibet. So there can be a lot of swirling emotions around them.
I have seen noise of a petition swirling online to revoke the invitation for the state visit for Donald Trump. But can King Charles say no to such a request?
Not really.
No,
I mean, and also, look, that is a matter for the government, and I think the government have suggested, unless there is yet another twist and turn in this saga, and of course that may well happen, I think it's very unlikely, because they see, as I've kept on saying on this programme and in the paper for many months now, the king is a linchpin in this relationship between Britain and the US at the moment.
And expanding on that, when he became king, Richard, Charles said that he wanted to be seen as a sort of a grandfather to the nation. And if he manages to help ease this diplomatic crisis with President Trump and Ukraine, he may well end up being something of a grandfather to the world, the Western world.
I'm sure.
Is that a bit over the top? I don't know.
I'm sure he'd love that title, but it's very awkward, fast-moving situation. I mean, to give you an example, there's been reports that the king wasn't very happy that when our Prime Minister Keir Starmer arrived at the White House, he sort of brandished this letter, which was meant to be a private letter.
Was it meant to be a private letter?
Well, it's not clear, but generally that sort of thing would be. And its contents were revealed. It was about the invitation for the state visit. And people were hailing the success of Keir Starmer's visit. But then very soon it sort of unravelled in the sense that whatever he tried to do on Ukraine appears to have come to nothing.
But he does like to see himself as a convener, doesn't he, Charles? And this could, if it plays well, it could be quite a significant part of his legacy.
It could, but I would just say he needs to be very, very careful on that front.
What do you think, Rebecca?
You're right, he is a convener, and I think we've seen actually over recent weeks how important that is. I do think Richard's right, he has to be very careful. The government will clearly want our head of state, our monarch, to do a lot of things, and it is up to his advisors at Buckingham Palace to ultimately decide if that's wise. That said, there is a little bit of a love-in between Buckingham Palace and the Labour administration in this country at the moment. They seem to really like Starmer and the ministers around him and what they're doing. So maybe that has something into play with it, I don't know.
Let's move on. Richard, I wanted to ask you about a piece written by your colleague Amanda Platell at the weekend, and she had some quite salty thoughts, didn't she, about how William and Catherine were approaching their royal roles?
Yes, Amanda Patel is always worth reading. She's always very lively, but often very controversial. And in this case, she was outlining why she thought William and Catherine really lacked the magic of monarchy. She was complaining that, she was talking about their visit to Wales, which we've discussed here, and we saw them making Welsh cakes and that type of thing. And she thought this was boring, and she was saying they should have...
Nothing boring about Welsh cakes,
and
excuse me.
She was complaining that they didn't, Prince William particularly, or the couple, didn't attend the BAFTA Film Awards, which is always a chance for lots of glamour, and, that would have been front page news. But I have to say, on this matter, I really disagree with her. For a start, as a social diarist, I've been to lots of these awards ceremonies, and they are seriously boring.
They can be.
They drag on for hours. This is just, these lovies just slapping each other on the back, telling each other how wonderful they are. I much prefer the fact, if he stayed away and did something more interesting, like a holiday in Mustique with his family, frankly. No, that was her essential point, and I think she's mistaken.
What do you think, Rebecca? Because obviously they're still in this position where, particularly as we've just discussing the news at the moment, they can't be seen to be upstaging the actual monarch with what they choose to do with their duties, can they?
Well, I'll let you into a little secret. There is this thing called the grid.
The grid.
The grid. And
Sounds like a game show.
It is a kind of household-wide kind of calendar, but I imagine it to literally be like a grid with like kind of chess pieces, and you kind of move the people around. So basically, they're not meant to clash.
Like actual chess. Like,
yes.
So can the king only move as he would on a chessboard?
Do you remember that?
I do.
Yeah.
With the Queen standing on the checkerboard in the church, and someone said she can go in any direction.
Watch out! Yeah, exactly. So they have this there to basically say, look, this is where all our principles are on any one day. So it is meant to stop clashes. Like we had literally last week on Wednesday, I think it was, 5 different engagements going on in different parts of the country, which were nightmares as reporters to cover that, let alone make sure that all that coverage all those engagements get appropriate coverage in the paper or online. So that is meant to stop those sort of things happening, but I think in reality, unfortunately, it doesn't work very well. So,
but also you can't control what all the newspapers are going to decide.
Exactly, and at the end of the day, as we will see next week, because on Monday it's Commonwealth Day, which is a massive day in the royal calendar. We have a big service at Westminster Abbey. It's been confirmed to us that the Prince and Princess of Wales will be there with the King and the Queen. And you can, although obviously the King is there and he is head of the Commonwealth, I can guarantee you, will it be no surprise that all the front pages will be the Princess of Wales turning up to her first Commonwealth Day service, I think probably in 2 years. So, unfortunately, what can they do?
What can they do? What can they do? Any idea? Thoughts and prayers to whoever is in charge of the grid. Now, Richard, there's an issue of the patronages that was raised this week, wasn't there?
Yes, this was just making the point that all those patronages, there were almost 500 that Queen Elizabeth had, have now been distributed, or organisations have been told that it's not going to be renewed. But the King and Queen have taken on, I think, around 400 of those patronages. And this means patrons of the Royal Society or organisations that usually really value this. And the point was made that William and Catherine have only taken on one of those, which I think is the Royal Marsden Hospital, where they've had treatment, where Catherine has had treatment. And that sort of led to a bit of criticism that, why haven't they taken on more? But I think the point is that most of these organisations, you want to have the monarch as your patron, or the monarch's consort, and that's what's happened. So the interesting question will be, when William and Catherine do become King and Queen, will they retain all these patronages in the same way that Charles and Camilla have?
Well, and it's interesting, isn't it, because they have made much of wanting to do more with fewer.
Absolutely.
But and obviously we hope it's a while off before they are the King and Queen, but Rebecca, they will have to be more visible in that respect, right?
I think they will, and they probably will have to take on more patronages, as well, of course, as all the state duties that they will have to take on day to day, the necessary state duties that they don't necessarily have to do now. And it will be a little bit of I think it will be tricky for them to negotiate, because, as you rightly say, for many years now it's always been made the point to us that they want to get more involved with a smaller number of charities and really get involved. That they made a point of saying what they don't want to do is do a lot of ribbon cutting, go to different parts of the country or around the world or the Commonwealth and never be seen there again. They want to leave a footprint there, whether that means a donation to a local organisation or getting two organisations to work together that hadn't worked before. But I'm not sure they're going to be able to have, I hesitate to use the word luxury, but they're not going to have the ability to do that when they become king.
It's an interesting debate about which is more effective and which is more desired, isn't it?
Absolutely, people have different views on it, and of course the way Queen Elizabeth did it and the King and Queen Camilla do now is not necessarily the way they should be doing it in the future. I mean, as Jason Knauf said in his interview with 60 Minutes in Australia the other week, every monarch has to bring something different to the role. Monarchy needs to evolve, so there's no saying that they're wrong or right.
Well, funny you should mention that, because we're getting on to J.T. Knauf right now. We'll be back with a look at Catherine and some of her fashion choices a little later in the show. But now let's look at some of the things you said about last week's show. Julianne wrote this after former Palace staffer Jason Knauf's fascinating interview, which covered topics such as William and Meghan. Jason Knauf is the consummate professional, she says. We can all read between the lines. His take on what William went through was revealing. It's easy to understand how awful that was for him and the whole family. And after our discussion about Princess Anne's recycling coats, more than 2 decades old, JLD had this to say: I love Princess Anne's sense of style, to the point and no nonsense. Her choices are so timeless that they don't go out of style. And the high quality means they last a lifetime. Bravo. Well, we'll be looking at another royal who recycles clothes imaginatively a little later on, and she is absolutely one of your favourites, so don't miss that. Earlier this week we put out a special episode reacting to the Sussex's new show With Love, Meghan. If you missed it, it's going to play straight after this. Can you believe it? More than 4,000 of you commented after that, and here are just a couple of those. Sore Throat says, goodness me, I hope that gets better. Sore Throat says, hi there Brits, I'm from Montecito and I guarantee you that our children collectively do not eat sandwiches with sprinkled nasturtiums. How utterly ridiculous. The show's emphatically demonstrated food prep few would emulate or eat. Okay, thanks for clearing that up. Fernania writes, not a duchess, not an influencer, just a cautionary tale. Ooh, I know. And Rachel Thomas said, Daddy, I met a prince. 5 years later, I sell jam and dog biscuits. Well, she's not selling them yet, is she, mate?
No, they're coming in spring 2025.
They're not on sale yet, but we take the point. Now, please do keep those comments coming in. We will stick with one of those stories that has come from Meghan's Netflix show, and that is their names. We discussed this a bit on Tuesday, but it's worth exploring a little bit more. Richard, you've written about this for Mail Plus today, haven't you? What have you said?
Yes, since the programme was broadcast on Tuesday, I've been talking to people about this. And I think this business of the Sussex name is really important, like genuinely significant for Meghan, because remember, not only did she stop Mindy Kaling in her tracks when she used the name Meghan Markle and corrected her.
That was like nails down a chalkboard for me.
Well, it really was, because the whole tone of the series is meant to be really easygoing and everything, so you just wouldn't kind of correct people. So that was odd. Meghan obviously wanted that to be included. But also, she talked about the same subject in her interview with People magazine. Now, what people have been saying to me on this side of the pond and at the palace is that they interpret it as a warning shot, that it's Meghan saying, don't you think about stripping us of our titles, which, remember, is something which has been talked about a lot each time they've done something terrible like criticise the royal family or reveal confidential discussions, as Harry did in his memoirs. What's been said in the past is it's something which could happen in the future, that the king might do it, if they carry on doing something else. Well, this is Meghan's way of saying, don't even think about that.
Do you think that's true, Rebecca? I mean, the timing does seem weird, and especially it does seem like a little issue that's become a big thing because she's made it a big thing.
I mean, she definitely was making a point of it, because even if that was her off-the-cuff reaction, you might look at it and go, do you know what, that doesn't really come across very well, can you cut that out? I mean, she is, as we see very clearly at the end of the show, the executive producer. It's there in black and white, Meghan, Duchess of Sussex, and clearly she wanted a point of it being kept in. The one thing I would say is that I've always been guided that there is no intention whatsoever of stripping them of these titles, because the king, a bit like their HRHs, to take them away completely feels that it would be a humiliation too far heaped on his son, and that it would really mean there would be no going back.
But technically what you're saying is it is a possibility.
It could happen. It was a gift of Queen Elizabeth effectively when they got married, and obviously the king is, you know, head of state and head of the family, and effectively it could be in his gift to take away by what we call letters patent, which we spoke about fairly recently, which is this kind of written expression of the king's wish, which becomes effectively law.
And let's be clear here, we're dealing with, I would say, paranoid people. And I've written about this in my article because there's a previous example of this, which is that when Archie was born, on his birth certificate, he was Archie Harrison, Mountbatten, Windsor, and the Sussexes briefed favoured journalists that they wouldn't be getting titles. Well, then we saw in the Oprah Winfrey interview that it was a big issue, that they felt that he was going to be denied a title. And they were really outraged by this. And in fact, Meghan went on to suggest that she thought that was because he was mixed race. So it was an explosive allegation, which was based on nonsense, because it was basically the rules are that grandchildren of the king, of the sovereign, would have the title. But at that point, Archie was a great-grandson of the monarch, Queen Elizabeth. So when Charles became king, he did have the right to have that title, which they've gone on to use. But so my point is, they are very sensitive about these issues, my goodness.
Well, they are, and it's we will put a link to the article in the description below if you want to read that from Richard. But it does also beg the question about, we talked about when William is king earlier. It feels like it's something that the spectre could be raised again when he is king. Well,
it's definitely something that could be done very easily if they cause more trouble. I mean, look, you know, it doesn't take a great fantasy, but let's say this amazing TV series of Meghan is not the success that Netflix had hoped. They might say, we're happy to give you another huge deal, but only if you do another programme about your relations with the royal family.
Yeah.
And at some point, the king or Prince William in the future might say, you know what, I do not want them to be tarnished with this royal dukedom, this royal title, they're embarrassing us. So, you know, Meghan's saying, if you do that, you've got a fight on your hands.
Oh, wow. Well, we'll answer some similar questions in a special viewer Q&A that we're putting out on the channel. So look out for that early next week. Now, Richard, there was also another apparent contradiction between what Meghan said about her name here and what she said about it before.
Well, this, I think what you're referring to is, again, in the Oprah Winfrey interview, where people have picked up on this, actually. They've gone back to that interview. And she made a point when she was, you know, whining about how awful it was to be in the royal family. She said that things were taken away from her, and, you know, including she's almost lost her name. And that seemed to be a reference to the Markle name, which she was sad about losing. Or that's the interpretation people have put on it. But then now she's saying, don't call me Markle. she's telling off her friends, you know, for using the name. So it's quite odd behaviour, I would say.
It's interesting. Now, Rebecca, another thing that has been picked up a lot about on social media was just how beige her outfits were throughout the whole series.
I mean, yeah, as we discussed in our emergency programme on Tuesday, I will never tire of that. That does make me giggle.
Urgent emergency.
That she wore, you know, these stunning outfits from top to bottom, without the even merest hint of an heirloom tomato dropped on any of them. But what did make me smile was obviously one of her big criticisms of when she was a royal is that she wasn't allowed to wear what she wanted, and she wasn't allowed to wear any colour and case it over shone the Queen, but then again they didn't want to dress in kind of neutral palette. You know, again, I think this goes back to the contradictions at the heart of a lot of what the Duchess of Sussex says in terms of the way she was treated. And I certainly know, just going back to your original point about the whole Sussex title thing, that was one of the things that really wound up the palace staff, because they spent a long time trying to explain this is how things work. This is no slight to you, it's the way things work. Just give it a few years and you'll get everything that you want. But they weren't willing to listen, they weren't willing to comprehend it.
I should say that maybe one reason for Harry and Meghan's sort of concern at that time was something that Queen Elizabeth did, because she brought in, issued a letters patent to give Princess Charlotte a title as well,
right.
Because as she was a girl, she wasn't going to get one. It was only the male heirs that would get the title. So she issued a letters patent. So I think at that point, Harry and Meghan started to think, well, wait a minute, why is she, that's been done for her, and then Archie might not get one.
But
so
because she was the daughter of the future king, was that why?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was Queen Elizabeth, it was a sort of almost like a feminist move, really,
right,
to show, to
yeah.
give that status and to kind of modernise the situation. But it was interpreted by Harry and Meghan as, this is another thing we've got to be worried about.
And just back to the show, do we know yet how it's rated, Meghan's show?
Well, what we do know is Meghan's put on her Instagram, she was boasting that it was in the top 10 of most popular Netflix programmes, I think. But look, I mean, a programme like this, with all the hype and the attention, you would have thought would get quite high because people want to see. I think all that Netflix will care about is how many people go on to watch lots of episodes and how long do they watch for. If they just tune in for 10 minutes and think, but are they hooked? That's what Netflix wants.
Yeah, and do we know yet how it's done?
I don't
think
so.
we've had viewing figures yet, but it's steady, the kind of in the top 10 around the world. But I would add to what Richard said, is I think there's going to be a lot of people, of course there will be the Meghan fans, but a lot of people will be tuning in for maybe an episode or two to see what the fuss is about, and it's whether there's longevity in that. And I'd probably, certainly based on the reviews,
I was just going to ask just one last question. Have you read a good review?
So I wrote a big piece in the Mail today.
Was yours the good review?
No, based on the reviews around the world. And the headline the sub-editors put on it was Meghan's show is universally ... disliked, basically.
Right.
The reviews have been excruciating bad. Now, of course, her supporters will say, well, that's what we'd expect of the British media. They would never give her a fair run. Fine if that's what they think. But those reviews are not just in the British media, they're in Variety, the Hollywood Bible, they're in the Hollywood Reporter, they're in Time magazine, which, let us not forget, only 4 years ago listed the Sussexes as one of their 100 people to watch. These are big, heavyweight, hard-hitting and influential magazines and publications in the United States, the exact publications that Meghan would want to impress, and they have universally said, for various different reasons, this is pretty awful.
Oh dear, oh dear. Anyway, Richard, a word on Prince Andrew now, and what was hoped would be a financial lifeline for him is now appearing in doubt.
Poor old Prince Andrew. Every time he thinks things are looking up, someone comes along and swipes things away from him. It was a Dutch company that wanted to buy basically his kind of contacts book from his Dragon's Den style venture Pitch at Palace, which was matching up entrepreneurs, young entrepreneurs usually, with funding. And they thought, God, that'd be quite good. That could be worth something. And there were suggestions that Andrew would be able to make quite a bit of money from it. But now, apparently, the Dutch companies has stressed that nothing's been signed, even though they've visited Buckingham Palace and they've met officials and everything about it. Nothing's been signed yet. And you do get the impression they might be getting a bit nervous. So,
Bugger.
Well, the worst thing is...
Isn't it? It's just like...
And then, if this doesn't come off for Andrew, oh dear, then he'll be... looking for some other deal to make. So
and that will worry Buckingham Palace, because again, this is what goes back to the whole point about why the king wants him out of Royal Lodge, because he can't afford that lifestyle and he wants him to have something that's more affordable, which will stop this what seems to be a perpetual cycle with the Duke of York, which is getting himself into hot water.
He needs a Netflix show.
Actually,
No, please, don't suggest that, because it could be very entertaining.
Actually, do you know what? At Home with the Yorks, I think that's got merit.
At Home
in
with
it.
my teddies.
And actually, that's what some of the caustic reviews of With Love Meghan have been about. Is they said there's one I think it was in the Guardian actually, which is quite a very anti-monarchist, left-leaning newspaper in the UK. But they said, look, at the end of the day, this is their third flop in a row, and out of the 4 products...
We don't know it's a flop yet.
Yeah, I mean, this is what they're predicting, but
Yeah.
they said that the fourth, the only one out of the 4 they've produced which was successful, involved a great deal of whining about the royal family. And they said maybe they just need to realise where their future lies and maybe become the new Osborns.
You never know. Well, as promised, we're going to return to Catherine now. Last week we discussed Anne's recycling old outfits. But a popular piece on the Mail Online Royals page has shown that the Princess of Wales is no stranger to reusing and updating some of her best looks. So recently it was this Ralph Lauren tweed jacket that she wore in Wales with a Gucci tartan skirt. But eagle-eyed royal watchers, and there are many of them, might have seen that she'd previously worn it 18 years ago at the Cheltenham Horse Racing Festival. There was 7 years between wears for this polka dot dress from Whistles that she wore in January this year, but again in 2018. And this lilac Alexander McQueen gown was worn twice over a 10-year period. Then there's this Elie Saab two-piece that has also been revisited, and she's also known for little stylish tweaks to outfits, often around the shoulders, like this Alexander McQueen floral jacquard dress or the Catherine Walker military-style coat, which first appeared in 2020 at the Remembrance Day service at the Cenotaph, was brought in back in 2024. This time, she had updated the look by removing the shoulder fringing, changing the buttons and adding a velvet bow to the neckline. I'm sure she didn't personally do that, but you know what I'm saying. Perhaps the longest lasting of her outfits was this double-breasted coat, which first appeared in 2001 and she was seen back in it in 2020 on a tour of Ireland. Now, Princess Anne gets a lot of attention for this, Rebecca, but Catherine she's doing her bit for sustainable fashion, isn't she?
Absolutely. I mean, she's often tweaking outfits as well as re-wearing them on a number of occasions. I have to say, I think my favourite, I think it's by Jenny Packham, and it's a white suit, but for trooping the colour, she kind of wore it with this really lovely black and white bow at the neckline, and the whole outfit with the hat, it made her look really Audrey Hepburn out of My Fair Lady. Do you know the one I mean?
Oh, I do, yeah.
Because actually the actual suit itself was so simple, and I think that's such a clever way of basically highlighting homegrown fashion, but also giving it little tweaks here and there, and just making it, much more up to date. As you know, I hate the kind of phrase about women re-wearing fashion, because guess what? Women wear outfits more than once.
Do they?
I know. Shocking.
She's crazy.
But so that does annoy me. But equally, we are guilty and complicit in that, because we as the viewing public want to see her wearing these amazing evening dresses.
I think because they're royal and they're so wealthy, it is always just, it's the fantasy, isn't it? Sort of like to just have this endless wardrobe. So when they repeat outfits, it's more remarkable.
Yeah, exactly. It's fun and enjoyable. Yeah. So which I think is why it's so clever, especially with that evening dress you mentioned. It wasn't just a little tweak. I mean,
look at Richard trying to look interested here. Let's move on, because... do you hear that? It is time for our Unsung Royal Hero of the Week. We know you love it. Rebecca, you're going to get to nominate. Who are you nominating?
So I'm really happy again about nominating this one. It's actually the Duke of Gloucester, late Queen Elizabeth's cousin. Now, I think it's a really interesting contrast. We started the programme talking about the king and this kind of role as a global peacemaker he's got. Meanwhile, the late Queen's cousin, who at the age of 80, is out there, and he was been in London, he's been Suffolk, Ipswich, he's been out there doing those kind of bread and butter, ribbon cutting, what they call in the family the grip and grin engagements, the proper bread and butter stuff.
Grip and grin. We are learning so much today.
I know, yeah,
this
exactly. This is a proper school day, isn't it? And I think that's really, really important. We focus on the high level stuff, we focus on the fashion, but equally, this stuff is really important to what makes having a monarchy in this country so important.
And of course, he's supported by a wife who was, you know, she was a foreign woman who married into the royal family and made a great success of it. So
where was she from?
There's an example. She's Danish, Birgitte.
Yeah, and actually I was going to mention, I did I think it's a really interesting exclusive feature with him last year, speaking to friends, speaking to family, to Focus when he turned 80. And what's so fascinating about his story is, I say him and Birgitte were the kind of Harry and Meghan of their day. You know, he married someone who wasn't from a royal family, who was from a different country. And he actually said, even though he was fifth in line to the throne, which is obviously the position that Harry occupies now, he wasn't going to become a working royal. And actually he kind of, not quite turned his back, but he became an architect. He trained as an architect, he worked as an architect, and then tragically his elder brother was killed in an air crash, and he had to step up to the plate and become a working royal. So he literally had to give up everything he knew, his life, his little house. He had a little flat overlooking the canal at Camden, I was told, and he had to become a former working royal, but he did it without a shred of complaint, and has just been there as a kind of the classic strength and stay to Queen Elizabeth throughout her life, and is still doing it now. So wow. I think it's quite a fascinating contrast in this week of all weeks.
That is an unsung hero that we have now deservedly sung.
Yes, good.
I'm pleased with that, thank you. Well, when we saw the King with Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, we thought we should mark the occasion with a montage of a few of our favourite pictures of the royals in Canada. Oh, Canada, as I believe you sing there. Hi to my friend Chad, who lives in Peachland. Wouldn't that be nice to live in
that sounds
Peachland?
Lovely.
Hope you enjoyed that. A reminder to subscribe to our channel if you don't already, to help us get over that 400,000 mark. We're so close. It's been another great fun show. Thanks to Rebecca, Richard, and to you for watching. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.